Years ago, a peaceful orange grove lay drew the sun of Sun, California. Today, that orange grove is Hollywood, city of dreams for boys and girls all over the world. Some, but not all of those dreams come true.
Hey, what is up, you guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today we are going to be going way back in time. Specifically, we're going to be going back to 1947. In 1947, a gallon of gas was 15 cents. A brand new home cost around $6 grand. World War II was coming to an end, and many people that you probably know were born this year, like Farrah Fawcett, David Bowie, Stephen King, and many others. And in 1947, Los Angeles was steadily growing and filled with people who craved a taste of fame. People moved from all over the country to have a chance at stardom, to make a name for themselves. But we're not just going to be going back to 1947. We're specifically going to be going back to January 15th, 1947. It was a Wednesday, and around 10 a.m. a woman named Betty Bersinger bundled her 3-year-old daughter up and left their Los Angeles home to pick up a pair of shoes that she was having repaired. As they walked down a sidewalk near the industrial section of Los Angeles, they passed by a vacant lot, and something lying in the weeds caught Betty's eye. At first glance, Betty thought that what she was seeing were pieces of a discarded Pale store mannequin, but as she got closer, she stopped in her tracks. She suppressed the urge to scream before grabbing her daughter and running to a nearby neighbor's house to call the police. Little did Betty know is that she stumbled upon LA's most notorious unsolved murder. When the police arrived, they discovered the nude body of a young woman thought to be around 17 years old or so. But the way that they found her is what makes this so gruesome. Her body was found in 2 pieces. She had been expertly bisected at the waist. She was laying face up. She had her arms raised over her head and bent at like a 45-degree angle. Her face was battered and beaten. She had many lacerations on her face and her body. A Glasgow smile or a Chelsea grin had been ripped into her face. So the Glasgow smile or the Chelsea grin is a form of torture. It's caused by someone cutting 2 small slits in the sides of someone's mouth, and when the person screams, these small slits grow, forming a gruesome Joker-esque kind of smile. So it is absolutely brutal. The lower half of the body was positioned about a foot away from the top half, really emphasizing the dismemberment, and her legs had been spread, most likely to degrade her after death. From the lack of blood on the scene, it was obvious that she had been killed elsewhere and relocated to this vacant lot. Her body had been recently washed of all of the blood, and her hair was still damp. But not only had she just been cleaned of blood on the surface, but her body had been completely drained of all blood. She had a gash in her thigh, which was later found to be how the killer removed a tattoo that the woman had, possibly trying to mask her identity. Her intestines were removed and neatly placed underneath her. So who was this woman? A fingerprint match would name Elizabeth Short, or Beth as she liked to be called, as the victim. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29th, 1924 in Hyde Park, a neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts. Her parents were Cleo and Phoebe Short, and she was one of 5 daughters. Beth had a super interesting childhood, to say the least. When she was around a year old, her family decided to relocate to Medford, Massachusetts. And her father worked designing and creating mini golf courses, which he was extremely successful in. But by 1929, the Great Depression had rolled around, causing Cleo to really feel the financial pressure of his chosen career path. So he drove his car to a bridge, put it in park, got out, and jumped off the bridge. except he didn't. He faked his own suicide and fled Massachusetts, going to California, leaving his wife and his 5 children behind to fend for themselves. So for most of her childhood, Elizabeth and everyone around her were under the impression that Cleo was dead. Phoebe and her daughters had to downsize, moving into a smaller apartment where they continued to struggle financially. Phoebe worked multiple jobs to try to keep her family afloat, but it was extremely hard. She was a single mother trying to raise and take care of 5 daughters during an extremely difficult time. But they really made the most of their situations. Phoebe and her daughters loved to watch movies together, and they really used the magic of Hollywood as an escape from the difficulties that they endured. Eventually, Phoebe received a letter from Cleo. He was living in California at this point, and he apologized and stated that he wanted to come back home to her and he wanted to be a family again. She pretty much told him that she wanted nothing to do with him and she never wanted to see him again. So, thank you. Next. As Elizabeth grew into her teenage years, everyone took note as to how she was forming into this beautiful young woman, and she talked nonstop about Hollywood and trying to make a name for herself. Everyone felt like she could really be super successful, and a lot of people felt that she could make it on her looks alone. She had porcelain skin, dark raven hair that would really emphasize her features, and crystal blue eyes. She would wear dark lipstick and dark tailored dress suits that really set her apart from the small town girls of Medford. She was poised and just had a certain aura about her that just kind of drew everyone in to her. She really had what it took to be the next Deanna Durbin, who was a successful singer and actress of that time. And she was even compared to Deanna on multiple occasions. Elizabeth was born with respiratory issues that developed into asthma and bronchitis as she got older. The cold Massachusetts winters would often elevate her symptoms, so her mother would send her to Miami to stay with family during the winter months, starting when Beth was just 16 years old. She began working as a waitress while she was there to pass the time and to save money. When she was 19 years old, she received a letter from her father, personally apologizing to her for abandoning her and her family. Cleo was staying in Vallejo, California at this point, and Beth took full advantage of this. Her and her father somehow managed to patch up their relationship, which I'm not sure how, but he offered for her to come live with him in California, and she gladly accepted. Cleo thought that he would get a maid and cook out of the deal, and Elizabeth had stars in her eyes for the possibility of becoming one of Hollywood's elite. Elizabeth had no interest in taking care of the man who had abandoned her and her family. They were practically strangers, and their relationship would soon sour when Cleo realized that this was not what he signed up for. Beth would often stay out late, and Cleo felt as if she was going on too many dates, deeming it unseemly for a young woman to be seen with so many different men. He also felt like she was lazy and had poor housekeeping skills, which I really don't think that Cleo had any room to talk, considering that was pretty much the only reason why he wanted her to move in with him anyway, was because he wasn't doing anything. But okay. But Cleo gave her $100 and kicked her out, forcing her to fend for herself once again. She began working as a cashier at the post exchange at Camp Cook, where she immediately got the attention of the many servicemen with her charm and her striking features. She even won the title of Camp Cutie of Camp Cook in a beauty contest. That's a tongue twister, I'm just gonna say Camp Cutie of Camp Cook. Despite being pursued by many men, Elizabeth wanted something more. She didn't just want to hook up with random guys. She wanted a lasting relationship that would end in a marriage. When word soon spread that Elizabeth was not an easy girl, the attention soon dwindled, leaving Elizabeth really uncomfortable with her position at Camp Cook. So she left and began staying with a friend who lived near Santa Barbara. On September 23rd, 1943, Elizabeth had been out with some friends at a restaurant where I'm guessing they became a little bit too rowdy, and had the police called on them. Elizabeth was underage at this point, so she was fingerprinted and booked, but not formally charged. This mugshot of hers would be considered one of the most famous pictures of Elizabeth. It was a mugshot, but she looked absolutely gorgeous in this shot, which is just nuts to me. This mugshot would also be used as a side-by-side comparison to a post-mortem photo of her. Her charm got the best of a police officer who felt sorry for her, so he arranged for Beth to be sent back to Massachusetts. This didn't last long, and Elizabeth would soon land herself back in California, this time in Hollywood. It was then that she met a pilot named Lieutenant Gordon Fickling, and she fell head over heels in love with this man. She had an infatuation with servicemen, and he really fit the bill for the kind of man that Elizabeth was searching for. However, their love would not last, as Gordon was shipped out to Europe to go fight in World War II. Elizabeth took a few modeling jobs here and there, but ultimately felt discouraged and unfulfilled in her career. She went back to Medford to spend the holidays with her family before returning to Miami to live with her relatives there. She had a few dates here and there, but nothing really serious until she met another pilot on New Year's Eve in 1944 and fell head over heels in love again. This one was named Matt Gordon. She must really like the name Gordon, I'm just saying. The two became inseparable and continued their relationship even after Matt was shipped out to India. It was then that Matt promised Elizabeth that as soon as he returned, they would get married. Beth had finally found what she was looking for, the love of a serviceman who she could call her own. Beth would often have sleepless nights worrying about her fiance being in the line of duty, but when the Japanese surrendered on August 14th, she really felt like she didn't have to worry any longer. She began happily planning their wedding and preparing for their future. But her plans were halted when she got word from Matt's mother that he had died in a plane crash on his way back home to the States. He was set to be home the following day. Elizabeth was heartbroken. The life that she had been planning in her head had suddenly been ripped from her grasp. As she recovered, she attempted to return to her old life by contacting some of her old Hollywood friends. One of those being Gordon Fickling, her ex-boyfriend. Seeing a possible future with him after the heartbreak that she had endured with Matt, she began writing to him and met up with him in Chicago when he was in town for a few days. She finally got that spark back in her eye and began falling in love with Gordon all over again. She agreed to join him in Long Beach before she ultimately decided to move back to California to continue to pursue her dreams in catching her big break. Gordon moved to North Carolina where he became an airline pilot, and the two remained in contact and friendly. He seemed like a really good guy too. Like, she really deserved to be happy, and I don't know. I mean, Elizabeth moved around California quite a bit. She didn't really have the income to stay in one place for any extended period of time, so she kind of home hopped for the majority of her time in Hollywood. One of the places that she landed in and would return to often was the home of a man named Mark Hansen. Mark Hansen was a successful businessman from Denmark who settled in Los Angeles in 1921. He owned several theaters and was part owner of the nightclub called Florentine Gardens on Hollywood Boulevard. This was set up to be the hangout spot for flocking servicemen who really reveled in the aesthetic of the nightclub that offered sex appeal, excitement, and entertainment. The nightclub gave budding actresses their start in the chorus line, one of which was Yvonne DiCarlo, who went on to play Lily Munster in the 1960s TV series. The popularity of this club also caught the attention of one Norma Jean Baker, who celebrated her marriage to her first husband at this nightclub. She, of course, went on to be known as Marilyn Monroe. Mark Hansen would give beautiful girls with high hopes and big dreams the opportunity to work in his establishment, either as entertainers or as waitresses. But he would also offer young women who were down on their luck the chance to live with him in his home for free. I say free, and by that I mean he would accept sexual favors over cash for giving these girls a place to stay. In the 1940s, this was not uncommon. Is it degrading and gross? Yeah, it is. But it was considered normal, and young women who had big dreams of Hollywood considered this to be an even trade. They just wanted to be somebody, and here they had that chance. Mark hired Elizabeth to work at Florentine Gardens in 1946, and she would live with Mark on and off from May to October of that year. She would share a room with Anne Toth, who was Mark's main girlfriend at the time. Now, at this house, she lived with 8 other young women, and rent was $1 a day. But if you were not able to afford that, then other favors would be accepted. Mark Hansen would allegedly try to seduce Elizabeth on multiple occasions, and Elizabeth turned him down every single time. She was still that vulnerable girl who had a lot of morals and didn't want to just hook up with any random man that she saw. Elizabeth would go on dates with different men often, and if Elizabeth were a young woman in today's times, doing this would cause her to be slut-shamed. But in the 1940s, this was extremely common. Young women would often go on dates with available and wealthy men as a means to get a free meal when they couldn't afford it. Elizabeth left Los Angeles on December 8th, 1946, taking a bus to San Diego. While in San Diego, Beth made a friend and a young woman named Dorothy French. Dorothy was a countergirl at the Aztec Theater and had found Elizabeth sleeping in one of the seats after an evening show. Elizabeth confided to Dorothy that she left Hollywood because finding an acting job had proved difficult and she was struggling. Dorothy felt sorry for her and offered her a place to stay at her mother's house for a few days until Elizabeth was able to get on her feet. But this lasted for a little longer than a few days. Elizabeth ended up being there for a little over a month. But it would be in San Diego where Elizabeth met another man, one who played an important role in her life and some even think in her death. Robert Red Manley was a married salesman who had a child on the way. He struck up a friendship with Elizabeth one day, and the two would see each other from time to time for a few weeks. He claims that he was attracted to Elizabeth, but says that they never slept together. On January 8th, 1947, Elizabeth asked Robert if he could bring her back to Hollywood. He agreed and picked her up from the French residence. The two would go to a party that night before checking in at a hotel. Robert claims that he slept on the bed and Elizabeth slept in a chair. Robert apparently had an appointment on the morning of January 9th and returned to the hotel to pick Elizabeth up around noon. She told him that she was returning to Massachusetts, but that she needed to meet with her sister at the Biltmore Hotel in Hollywood first. So he drove her there, but he had to leave for another appointment around 6:30 p.m. According to Robert, he last saw Elizabeth making phone calls in the lobby. So this makes Robert the last person to be seen with Elizabeth before she disappeared. Because of this, he was the LAPD's first suspect in her murder. Elizabeth was missing for 6 days before her body was found on the morning of January 15th, 1947. This leads us back to the gruesome scene. After Betty Bersinger called the police, officers Frank Perkins and Will Fitzgerald arrived at the scene within minutes. The LAPD immediately realized that this horrendous crime needed to be made a top priority because it was unlike anything they had ever seen. They covered the body with a sheet to, I guess, save whatever kind of dignity her body could have had left. Captain John Donahue assigned 2 senior detectives to this case, Detective Sergeant Harry Hansen and Detective Finis Brown. By the time Hansen and Brown had arrived at the scene, the news had already begun to spread like wildfire. The scene was littered with reporters, photographers, and curious spectators who were both intrigued and disgusted. The detectives cleared the area and began investigating while the body was transported to the morgue. They wanted to identify her as quickly as possible, so they lifted fingerprints and sent them off to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., but heavy snowstorms delayed the identification for up to a week. This was way too long in their eyes. They needed to find out who this woman was, and fast. So Warden Woolard, I think I'm saying that right, he was the assisting managing editor of the Herald Express, and he offered to help. The newspaper had recently purchased new technology that could help them get the fingerprints to the FBI quickly. But of course, the newspaper expected an exclusive on the case. When the fingerprints first transmitted, they could not be read. Russ Lapp, a Herald Express photographer, suggested that they reverse the lab process and use the prints as negatives and enlarge the prints, making it clear for the FBI specialists to read. They were able to identify the victim as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. The last known information that they were able to get on her was that she was living in Santa Barbara and had worked at Camp Cook. The coroner's report would state that she had been hit several times in the head until she was knocked unconscious, and the killer proceeded to put her head in a rusty vice-type contraption that left an orangey-brown residue on both sides of the victim's nose and on the sides of her neck. It's speculated that this contraption was used to keep her head in place as the killer created the Glasgow smile into her face. Marks on her body indicated that either wire or rope had been used to restrain her. After she was bound, she was tortured for an untold period of time. There was no sperm present on the body as it had been washed clean, but the cause of death was ruled as a hemorrhage, shock, and loss of blood from the blows to the head and gashes made to the face. It's noted that she was still alive, although barely, when she was bisected. The Herald Express had breaking information on the case, and the LAPD had identified the victim. However, the symbiotic relationship between the paper and the LAPD began to shift. William Randolph Hearst, owner of the Herald Express, was incredibly wealthy and had stable reporters who discovered leads and valuable evidence in the case. He was willing to share this crucial information to the LAPD, but for a price. Hearst proposed that the Herald Express would continue investigating clues and would be granted exclusives, and the LAPD would have access to all the information the reporters uncovered. While LAPD Captain Donahue was not especially happy with these terms, he was desperate for information on the case and took the offer. I have a huge issue with how the media and the press portrayed Elizabeth. They literally called her a sex fiend when reporting her death. It seems as if they cared more about her body count than they did about her brutal murder. Rumors started floating around that she was easy and that she was a prostitute, which she wasn't. She literally left Camp Cook because of how she was treated when she wouldn't give it up. She was just a young girl who was down on her luck, who happened to enjoy the attention and the whining and dining from young men. She was doing what so many other young women at that time were doing, but the only difference between her and them was that she got caught up with the wrong one and ended up murdered. Wayne Sutton was a Herald Express employee who was assigned to locate Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, in Medford, Massachusetts. Sutton quickly found Phoebe and was then instructed to give her the news about her daughter's death. However, Wayne knew that he needed to get information about Elizabeth first. Her mother would likely be too shaken up and upset to tell him information about Elizabeth had he just come out and told her the brutal truth. So he decided to tell Phoebe that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest in Los Angeles and needed to get some information about Elizabeth for the papers. Phoebe loved to talk about her beautiful daughter and was willing to tell Wayne any kind of information that he wanted to know. Once he had gotten his information, like the leech that he is, his boss instructed him to tell Phoebe the brutal truth. Phoebe did not believe him. She couldn't fathom that her daughter was dead, let alone had been murdered. The LAPD had to contact local Medford police and send them to the residence to tell Phoebe the story in person before she would accept the news. Elizabeth's father, Cleo, was said to have been living in close proximity to where Elizabeth's body was found. However, when asked, Cleo refused to go to the morgue and identify her body. He also didn't attend the funeral. The funeral of his daughter that he abandoned not only once, not only twice, but now 3 times. The Herald Express was soon overcome with anonymous reports and tips, some of which actually proved to be useful. One anonymous caller told the reporters that Elizabeth had kept photo albums of herself and her friends in a trunk. The trunk had gone missing during shipment from Chicago to Los Angeles. However, the Herald Express was determined to relocate it. They found it at the Greyhound Express station in downtown Los Angeles. They would finally be able to illustrate Elizabeth's story with photos of herself, her friends, and her former lovers. On January 17, 1947, a photograph of Elizabeth was featured on the front page of the Herald Express. The paper had referred to her as the Black Dahlia, a name that would still stick almost 70 years later. It's debated where this nickname truly came from. Some sources say that Elizabeth was called the Black Dahlia long before her death, and some claim that her death was what inspired this nickname. The Los Angeles Times reported that customers at a drugstore in Long Beach dubbed Elizabeth the Black Dahlia as a joke in reference to the film The Blue Dahlia, which was released 9 months prior to her murder. Elizabeth had frequented the drugstore when she first lived in Long Beach, and the customers remembered Elizabeth for her black hair, the black attire that she would often wear, her fair complexion, and the fact that she would sometimes wear flowers in her hair. Before Black Dahlia caught on, Elizabeth's killing was named the werewolf murder. However, a reporter found out about the nickname Black Dahlia. The newspapers ran with the nickname shortly after, and the case of the Black Dahlia was born. Even after Black Dahlia became more prominent, some sources still referred to her killer as the werewolf. FBI criminal profiler and author John Douglas believes that the killer must have known Elizabeth very well and had some kind of emotional ties to her. The horrific violence inflicted upon the body and the public display of the body would indicate that the killer wanted the world to see Elizabeth Short and the wrongdoings that he had believed that she had done to him. On January 23rd, 1947, the Examiner received a phone call from a man claiming to be Elizabeth Short's killer. He told the editor that he was upset about the way that the story was being told in the papers. He offered to mail some of Elizabeth's belongings to the paper to prove that it was him. The Examiner received a package and letter formulated from magazine clippings from an anonymous sender the following day. This package included Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen on the cover. Mark Hansen quickly became a suspect. Elizabeth's handbag and shoe were found in a trash can the same day that the Examiner received this package. These items were found only a few miles from the vacant lot where Elizabeth's body had been dumped. The items were identified by Robert Manley before the LAPD no longer saw him as a suspect. This could have been a major mistake on the killer's part. He likely didn't assume that the items would be linked to the murder, but they were. The location of the items indicated that the killer may have been in walking distance from the vacant lot and from where the items were found. Soon enough, more letters began pouring into the various newspaper offices in Los Angeles. These letters had messages compiled from newspaper and magazine clippings, which were consistent with the appearance of the first letter that the police received with Elizabeth's belongings. Some of these letters to the Herald Express read, quote, "I will give up in Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me," end quote. Due to the way that Elizabeth was cleanly cut in two, the LAPD was convinced that her killer had some kind of medical training. According to an FBI letter on February 25th, 1947, quote, "The manner in which Elizabeth Short's body was dissected has indicated the possibility that the murderer was a person somewhat experienced in medical work. The Los Angeles Police Department has undertaken to develop suspects among the medical and dental schools in the area, as well as among other students who have anything to do with human anatomy." However, the first suspect to be arrested for Elizabeth Short's murder was not one of these medical students. It was Robert "Red" Manley. At the time, he was on a business trip, so authorities pretty much just waited for him to come back, and when he did, they handcuffed him and brought him to the station for questioning. A background test on Robert would show that he was discharged from the military for being mentally unfit. He was given 2 lie detector tests, which came back inconclusive, but because his alibi for January 14th and 15th was solid, the LAPD let him go. I honestly don't think that he had anything to do with it. I mean, he was super cooperative with the police and helped in any way that he could. After the murder of Elizabeth, he would go on to suffer from nervous breakdowns and hallucinations. He died from an accidental fall on January 16, 1986, 39 years and a day after Elizabeth's fateful end. Sure, the guy had issues, but I really do not think that he had anything to do with it. But that's just me. Due to the complexity of the case, the original investigators viewed every single person who knew Elizabeth as a possible suspect. By June of 1947, police had processed and eliminated at least 75 different suspects. And by December of 1948, the detectives had considered a total of 192 suspects. About 60 people actually confessed to Elizabeth Short's murder, but only about 22 of these suspects were considered viable by the Los Angeles District Attorney. So let's get into a few of these suspects. We're not going to be going into all of them just because there are a lot, but we are going to be talking about the few main ones that seem most likely to be guilty. We already talked about Robert Manley, so let's go ahead and move on to a man named Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey was a Los Angeles surgeon who lived 1 block south of the vacant lot in which Elizabeth's body was found, until he left his wife in October of 1946. His daughter was actually a friend of Elizabeth's older sister, Virginia, and had been the matron of honor at her wedding. When Walter died in January of 1948, his autopsy showed that he had actually been suffering with a degenerative brain disease. After his death, his widow alleged that his mistress knew a terrible secret about him and was made the main beneficiary upon his death as a result. But Walter was 67 years old at the time of the murder and had no known history of violence or any kind of criminal record or anything like that. And he's not known to have ever met Elizabeth, despite his daughter and Elizabeth's sister being such close friends. When Larry Harnish, a Los Angeles Times writer, began studying the case in 1996, he eventually concluded that Walter Bailey could have been Elizabeth's killer. Although a lot of people question whether or not Walter's mental and physical condition would have been consistent with the brutality of this type of crime, the original investigators' theory was that the body was cut in half because the killer was not strong enough to carry it intact, partially answers this objection. Larry theorized that Walter's neurological deterioration contributed to the possible violence against Elizabeth. In devising his theory, Larry consulted retired FBI profiler John E. Douglas, who advised that the very public location of the dump site was significant, since the killer had the ability to transport the body to a more remote site, where it may not have been discovered. The site was literally 1 block away from property that Walter and his estranged wife, Ruth, had owned. Douglas also advised that the facial lacerations indicated personal anger towards the victim. It's alleged that Elizabeth would falsely tell men that she had a son who died tragically, and Wayne himself actually did have a son who died when he was just 11 years old after being hit by a car. The deceased child's birthday was January 13th, and Elizabeth's body was found on January 15th. So some people do make this as a connection. Do I really think that Elizabeth told men that she had a son who had died? No, I don't. I don't see why anyone would say that. I don't see why anyone would lie and say that. But I did feel the need to mention that, since people think that that's a reason why Walter could have been so angry. The next suspect we're going to be touching on is Mark Hansen. So Mark Hansen was one of the last people to actually talk to Elizabeth before she went missing. He spoke with her the day before, and he actually gives mixed answers when asked what their conversation was about. Mark Hansen was a predator. I'm just gonna be honest. He'd get girls who were down on their luck to sleep with him in exchange for a place to stay because he knew that he could. It seems as if Elizabeth would end up back at Mark's house time and time again when she had nowhere else to go. Is it possible that when she got kicked out of the French residence that she called Mark and asked him if she could come back yet again. Maybe this time he made a move that he deemed non-negotiable at that point, and she turned him down like she had done many times before, but this time he snapped. We know that when some of Elizabeth's belongings got sent to the Examiner, that one of those belongings was an address book with Mark Hansen's name embossed on it. He claims that he never used this address book and that it was pretty much only used by Elizabeth and that it was hers. He pretty much said that he had gotten it as a gift and he never really used it, and so he gave it to Elizabeth for her to use. He was one of the first suspects in the case and was still one of the prime suspects as late as 1951. So they had their eye on him for quite some time. It's believed that Mark Hansen had spent some time at Sweden's medical surgical school, which would explain the precise bisection of Elizabeth's body. It's also said that Mark held these elaborate parties at his Hollywood boarding house, and that members of the LAPD and the chief of detectives would attend these parties and possibly aided in some kind of cover-up of Elizabeth's murder. It's also mentioned that Mark actually owned a Ford Lincoln Mercury car lot on Hollywood Boulevard, and his LAPD friends would be spotted coincidentally driving brand new Lincoln cars around town. So maybe that's like a hush-hush kind of a gift? I don't know. Mark Hansen died of natural causes in 1964, and no charges were ever brought against him. He had no criminal record and no known history of violence. Popular accounts of the Black Dahlia case often portray Mark as having some kind of ties to organized crime, but there is no evidence to this. The next suspect that looks pretty good for this crime is a man named Leslie Dillon. He was 27 years old. He worked as a bellhop. He was an aspiring writer and had previously been a mortician's assistant. In October of 1948, Leslie wrote a LAPD psychiatrist, Dr. J. Paul DeRiver, about the Black Dahlia case. Leslie told DeRiver that he had heard about Elizabeth Short's case from a True Detective magazine where DeRiver spoke on the case. He wanted to hear DeRiver's theories on the case because he had an interest in sadism and sexual psychopaths and wanted to write a book on these topics. Leslie never confessed to the murder. Instead, he said that a friend named Jeff Connors was Elizabeth Short's killer. As DeRiver and Leslie started riding back and forth from Florida to Los Angeles, DeRiver started to believe that Connors was not a real man. He believed that Leslie himself was responsible for Elizabeth's murder and kind of created Connors as a figment of his imagination to cope with the gruesome act. In December of 1948, Leslie agreed to meet with DeRiver, and DeRiver offered 3 potential locations: Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. Leslie expressed reservations about meeting him in Los Angeles, so he decided to meet DeRiver in Las Vegas. DeRiver and undercover LAPD officer Sergeant John O'Mara met with Leslie in Las Vegas. DeRiver interrogated Leslie, and O'Mara kind of acted as a bodyguard. The undercover officer also remembered Leslie talking about bleeding a body before embalming by making an incision on the upper thigh and inserting a tube to drain the blood. Leslie had this medical experience when he worked as a mortician's assistant. So could that gash on Elizabeth's thigh been what was used to drain her blood? I know that it says that a tattoo was removed, but could it be 2 birds, 1 stone, removing the tattoo as well as draining her blood through her thigh? Leslie Dillon had hoped to return to California with DeRiver and O'Mara to show them his friend Jeff Connors. When they arrived in San Francisco, They searched for Jeff Connors, but had difficulty in locating him. The LAPD confronted Leslie, trapped him, trying to pull some kind of confession out of him. He eventually offered the police intimate details about Elizabeth's murder that the investigators had even a hard time trying to explain. During questioning, Leslie had been held against his will in a hotel near Los Angeles and had been denied his constitutional rights. An undercover officer handcuffed him and officially took him into custody at the Highland Park station on January 10th, 1949. Detectives Finis Brown and Harry Hansen questioned Leslie the evening of January 10th. The following night, the LAPD received a call from San Francisco police saying that they had found Jeff Connors. But his name was not Jeff Connors. His real name was Artie Lane. Lane had been living in Los Angeles at the time of Elizabeth's murder and was actually working at Columbia Studios as a maintenance man. And Columbia Studios was actually a common hangout place for Elizabeth. There has been some kind of speculation that Leslie Dillon and Artie Lane are the same man, but the LAPD has never confirmed or denied this theory. But by the end of 1949, LAPD and detectives were no longer interested in Leslie. The LAPD concluded that he was most likely in San Francisco when the murder took place. However, they could not conclusively place him there. In fact, the police could not account for Leslie's whereabouts between January 9th and January 15th, 1947, the days when Elizabeth Short had still been considered missing. Leslie Dillon later filed a $100,000 claim against the city of Los Angeles for the way that he was treated during this case. Yet the lawsuit was dropped when the LAPD discovered that he was actually wanted by the Santa Monica Police Department for robbing a hotel while he was working as a bellhop there. So because of everything that happened between DeRiver and Leslie Dillon, it actually triggered a 1949 grand jury investigation into the Elizabeth Short case and police cover-up and corruption in Los Angeles. Am I the only one who thought it was weird that they have no record of where Leslie Dillon was during the days that Elizabeth was missing? Are we just supposed to think of this as like some kind of weird coincidence? Okay. And finally, last but not least, we have George Hodel, the man who most people believe is actually Elizabeth Short's killer. Dr. George Hill Hodel Jr. came under police scrutiny in October of 1949 when his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar, accused him of molesting her. George hired the top-of-the-line criminal defense attorneys, and despite 3 witnesses testifying that they had seen George molesting Tamar, he was acquitted in December of 1949. Trial led the LAPD to include George, a physician specializing in sexually transmitted diseases, among its many suspects in the Dahlia case. Police put George under surveillance from February 18th to March 27th, 1950, to ascertain whether he could be implicated in the murder. In the surviving transcripts of microphone recordings, George was heard making some highly incriminating statements. Most of the transcript is pretty dull at first, with George having sex, berating his secretary, and talking about money problems. However, on February 19th, 1950, there was something horrific in the recording. 8:28 p.m., woman screamed again. It should be noted the woman not heard before the scream. Later that same day, Hodel was recorded talking to a friend of his. Quote, "Realized there was nothing I can do. Put a pillow over her head and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Expired 12:59. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her." End quote. What? Their surveillance routinely continued, catching this highly incriminating statement. Quote, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." End quote. Okay, what the secretary referred to was Ruth Spalding, who was actually suspected to have been murdered by George. He was present when Ruth allegedly overdosed and had burned some of her belongings before the police were called. The case was dropped due to the lack of evidence because he burned it, but documents were later found that indicated that Ruth was about to publicly accuse George of intentionally misdiagnosing patients and billing them for laboratory tests, medical treatment, and prescriptions not needed. George's son, former LAPD homicide detective Steve Hodel, believes Elizabeth may have been one of his father's patients. Steve has been so vocal about how he feels that his father is actually Elizabeth Short's murderer. In 2003, Steve Hodel published a book, Black Dahlia, Avenger, A Genius for Murder, in which he claimed his father, who died in 1999, had murdered Elizabeth and was responsible for other unsolved killings over 2 decades. Steve had seen 2 pictures in his father's photo album that he claims resemble Elizabeth, although her family insists that they are not of her, and many other observers have failed to see the resemblance. Since beginning his investigation, Steve located and identified one of the photographic subjects as a former friend of George Hodel. The other photograph remains unidentified. To me, I don't think that this picture resembles Elizabeth at all. The only thing that they really have in common is the pale skin and dark hair. Other than that, the facial features look very off to me. After reviewing the information published in Steve's book, Head Deputy DA Stephen K. proclaimed the case solved, but others have noted that he had formed this conclusion by treating Steve's many disputed theories as fact. In 2009, Hodel published Most Evil, Avenger, Zodiac, and the Further Serial Murders of Dr. George Hill Hodel, in which he claimed that his father was the Zodiac killer, which I'm not 100% too sure about, to be quite honest. I think that's kind of a stretch. So who do you think brutally mutilated Elizabeth Short? The woman who craved fame so much and got it in the most horrendous way possible. I don't think that this is how she thought that she would be remembered, or that this would be her legacy as the Black Dahlia. I really think that she lost her name over time. You know, people stopped viewing her as Elizabeth Short, but started viewing her as the Black Dahlia, which, if that was her nickname that she was given in life, then that's fine. But if this was a nickname that was given to her because of her death, I really think that she needs to continue to be personified instead of just known for her death. Because Elizabeth Short was known to be a very sweet and loving and caring person, and I feel like she deserved more than the hand that she got dealt. She did not deserve to be mutilated and to have her beauty taken away from her, because I guarantee the person who did it knew that this was one of the things that she cared about the most, and they ripped that from her. So let me know your theories down below in the comments. I know that this one was a really rough one. It's a super gory and horrendous case, and it's honestly heartbreaking. She was 2 years younger than what I am now, and I could not. Thank you as always for watching this video. Be sure to give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and if this is your first video of mine to watch, hey, thanks for joining us, and be sure to join the weirdness and subscribe. So yeah, that's it for me today, guys. So stay weird, stay safe, and stay home, stay home, and I will see you in my next one. Bye, guys.
So I was on the sidewalk, and there was glass and stuff strewn out because it wasn't very well maintained. And as I was walking along, I happened to glance over at my side, and I saw this strange sight. It looked like a mannequin that had